Martha Whitmore pressed her face against the cold train window and watched the snow-covered mountains grow bigger with each passing mile. Her breath made small clouds on the glass, and she wiped them away with her worn glove. The train had been her home for 3 long days, carrying her farther and farther from everything she had ever known. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The December cold seemed to seep through the train car walls, making her shiver. At 23, Martha had learned that life could change in the blink of an eye. Just 6 months ago, she had been a happy wife with a small but comfortable home. Now she was traveling alone to marry a complete stranger, the other. Passengers on the train looked warm and well-fed. Martha tried not to stare at their thick coats and leather boots. Her own dress had been mended so many times that the patches had patches. She carried everything she owned in one small carpet bag that sat on her lap. Inside were 2 other dresses, some undergarments, her mother's Bible, and a single photograph of her late husband, Thomas. Thomas had been a good man. He worked hard on their little farm outside of Cleveland, growing vegetables to sell at the market. They were never rich, but they had enough. They talked about having children someday, maybe expanding the farm, growing old together. But consumption took him quickly. One day he was coughing a little, and 3 weeks later he was gone. That was when Martha discovered the debts. Thomas had borrowed money to buy seeds and tools, always planning to pay it back after the harvest. But there had been no harvest to pay for anything. The men Thomas owed money to were not the kind to forget about debts. They came to the house 3 days after the funeral. Martha still remembered the way Mr. Jameson had looked at her when she explained she had no money to pay. His eyes had moved up and down her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well now," he had said with a nasty smile, "I'm sure we can work something out. A young woman like you has other ways to pay off debts?" She had slammed the door in his face, but she knew he would be back. Men like Jameson always came back. Martha had heard whispers about other women who found themselves in similar situations. Some disappeared completely. Others ended up working. In the kind of places respectable women never talked about, the train whistle blew, pulling Martha from her dark thoughts. She looked out the window and saw they were slowing down. A small wooden sign read, "Cedar Ridge, population 847. This was it. This was where her new life would begin. For better or worse, Martha reached into her carpetbag and pulled out a crumpled letter. She had read it so many times that the paper was soft as cloth. The handwriting was neat and careful. "Dear Miss Whitmore, I received your letter and photograph. I am a widowed rancher in need of a wife who can help with the household and is not afraid of hard work. I am 34 years old and own a cattle ranch 10 miles from town. I'm not a wealthy man, but I can provide a home and protection for the right woman. If you are still interested, please come to Cedar Ridge. I will meet you at the train station. Respectfully, Samuel Carter." The letter was not romantic, but it was honest. That was more than Martha could say for the other men who had answered her advertisement. Some had made promises that sounded too good to be true. Others had written things that made her throw their letters straight into the fire. Samuel Carter's letter was simple and direct. He needed a wife and she needed a husband. It was business, not love, but maybe that was better. Love had not saved her from her current situation. As the train pulled into the station, Martha felt her heart start beating faster. Through the window, she could see people waiting on the wooden platform. Most were there to meet family or friends, but one man stood alone. He was tall and wore a dark coat and hat. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders. The train came to a stop with a loud screech of brakes and a cloud of steam. Martha gathered her courage and her carpetbag and made her way to the door. The conductor helped her down the steps, and suddenly she was standing on solid ground for the first time in 3 days. The air was thin and cold. Much colder than Ohio. Mountains rose up around the small town like giant walls, their peaks covered in snow that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Martha had never seen anything so beautiful or so intimidating. This place was so different from the flat farmland she was used to. She looked around the platform, trying to spot Samuel Carter. The man in the dark coat was walking toward her, and Martha felt her stomach flutter with nerves. As he got closer, she could see his face clearly for the first time. He was older than she had expected, with lines around his eyes and gray streaks in his brown hair. His face looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "Miss Whitmore?" he asked, touching the brim of his hat politely. His voice was quiet and careful, like he was talking to a skittish horse. "Yes, I'm Martha Whitmore," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "You must be Mr. Carter." "I am Samuel Carter." He reached for her carpetbag, and she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult for you." "It was fine, thank you." Martha studied his face as he spoke. He seemed nervous, which was somehow comforting. She had been worried he might be overconfident or demanding. Instead, he seemed as uncertain about this arrangement as she was. "I have a wagon waiting," Samuel said, gesturing toward the street. "We can go into town, get you settled at the hotel." I thought you might want some time to think things over before we make any final decisions." Martha felt a flutter of panic. Had he changed his mind? Had he taken one look at her and decided she would not do? "Have I disappointed you in some way, Mr. Carter?" No, not at all," he said quickly. "It's just, this is a big step for both of us. I want you to be sure this is what you want. Marriage is well, it's permanent." As they walked toward his wagon, Martha noticed how Samuel kept glancing at her sideways, as if he was trying to figure out whether she was real. She understood the feeling. The whole situation felt like a strange dream. Yesterday she had been Martha Whitmore, a widow with no prospects and creditors at her door. Today she was in Colorado, about to marry a man she had never met. The wagon was simple but sturdy, pulled by two brown horses that stamped their feet in the cold. Samuel helped her up onto the seat, and she was surprised by how gentle his hands were. Whatever else Samuel Carter might be, he was not the kind of man who would hurt a woman. As they drove through the main street of Cedar Ridge, Martha looked around at her new home. It was a typical western town, with wooden buildings lining a wide dirt road. There was a general store, a bank, a church, and a saloon. People walked along the wooden sidewalks, bundled up against the cold. Some waved at Samuel, and he nodded back politely. "It's not a big place," Samuel said, noticing her looking around. "But it's peaceful. Good people, mostly." "It seems very nice," Martha replied, and it did seem nice in a quiet way. So different from the busy, dirty streets of Cleveland. Here, she could breathe clean air and see the sky stretching endlessly overhead. They stopped in front of a two-story building with a sign that read Cedar Ridge Hotel. Samuel helped her down from the wagon and carried her bag inside. The lobby was small but clean, with a fireplace that filled the room with warmth and the smell of burning wood. "I'd like 2 rooms, please," Samuel told the clerk behind the desk. "For myself and the lady." Martha felt her cheeks grow warm. 2 rooms meant he was not expecting her to share his bed right away. It also meant he was treating her with respect, giving her space to make her own choices. After months of men looking at her like she was something they could buy or take, Samuel's consideration was like a gift. As they climbed the stairs to the second floor, Martha realized she was no longer the desperate woman who had fled Ohio with nothing but a carpetbag and a prayer. She was still scared, still uncertain about the future, but for the first time in months, she felt safe. Whatever happened next, she was no longer alone in the world. The room Samuel had gotten for her was small but comfortable, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the mountains. After he left her alone to rest, Martha sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, but from relief. She had made it. She was here, in this strange new place, about to start a new life with a man who seemed kind and decent. Outside her window, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make. But tonight, for the first time in months, Martha felt like she could breathe again. She was no longer running from her past. She was walking toward her future, whatever that might hold. The next morning, Martha woke to the sound of wind rattling her hotel room window. She had slept better than she had in months, despite being in a strange place. The bed was comfortable, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt truly safe behind a locked door. She dressed carefully in her best dress, which wasn't saying much. It was dark blue wool with tiny flowers, and she had mended a small tear near the sleeve just before leaving Ohio. She braided her brown hair and pinned it up properly, wanting to look respectable when she saw Samuel again, downstairs in the hotel. Dining room, Samuel was already waiting at a small table by the window. He stood up when he saw her, pulling out a chair like a true gentleman. Martha noticed he had shaved and put on a clean shirt. His dark hair was combed back, and he smelled faintly of soap and something else, maybe sadness. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "I hope you slept well." "I did, thank you. And please call me Martha. If we're going to be married, we should use first names." Samuel nodded, but she could see the word married made him uncomfortable. "Martha, then, and I'm Samuel." They ordered breakfast from a young waitress who kept stealing curious glances at them. Martha realized that in a town as small as Cedar Ridge, a stranger arriving to marry the local rancher was probably big news. She wondered what people were saying about her, what they thought of a woman desperate enough to travel across the country to marry a man she'd never met. The food was simple but good: eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey. As they ate, they made awkward conversation about the weather and her train journey. But Martha could tell Samuel's mind was elsewhere. He kept reaching into his vest pocket and touching something, then pulling his hand away quickly after they finished eating. Samuel suggested they take a walk around town so Martha could get familiar with the place. Cedar Ridge was small enough to see everything in about an hour. There was the general store run by an elderly couple named the Hendersons, who smiled warmly at Martha and welcomed her to town. The church was small but pretty, with a bell tower and stained glass windows. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, where about 20 children learned their lessons from a young teacher named Miss Peterson, but it was clear that Samuel was just going through the motions. He answered Martha's questions politely, but his heart wasn't in it. Finally, as they stood outside the church looking at the mountains in the distance, Martha decided to speak up. "Samuel," she said gently, "you seem troubled. If you've changed your mind about marrying me, I'd rather you just say so. I won't be angry." Samuel looked startled, as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. "No, it's not that. You're a fine woman, Martha. Any man would be lucky to have you as a wife." "But?" Martha prompted. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the snow-covered peaks. Finally, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small photograph. His hands shook as he held it out to her. Martha looked at the picture and saw a beautiful young woman with blonde hair and a bright smile. She was holding a baby, and both of them looked happy and healthy. The woman wore a wedding dress that was clearly expensive, with lace and tiny buttons. Martha felt a stab of something, not jealousy exactly, but awareness of how different she was from this lovely woman. "Your first wife?" Martha asked softly. "Carolyn." Samuel's voice broke slightly. "On the name. She died 2 years ago, trying to bring our son into the world. The baby ... little David. He didn't make it either. I lost them both in one terrible night." Martha's heart ached for him. She could see the pain written all over his face and the way his shoulders sagged and his eyes looked empty. This was a man who had loved deeply and lost everything. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, handing the photograph back to him. "They were beautiful." "She was everything good in this world," Samuel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Carolyn could make anyone smile just by walking into a room. She loved flowers and music and she was going to teach our children to play piano. She had it all planned out." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. Not for herself, but for Samuel and for the woman who had died too young. "She sounds wonderful." She was. "And I don't know if I can be the husband you deserve, Martha. When Carolyn died, something inside me died too. I go through the motions of living, but I'm not really alive anymore. I answered your letter because the ranch is too much for one man, and the loneliness gets so heavy sometimes I can barely breathe, but I'm not sure I have anything left to give a wife. Martha was quiet for a moment, thinking about his words. She looked at this broken man standing beside her, and she saw something of herself in him. They were both running from pain, both trying to figure out how to keep living when the life they'd planned was gone. "Samuel," she said finally, "do you think I came here looking for a fairy tale romance?" He looked at her in surprise. I don't know. Most women want love, don't they?" "Most women have choices," Martha replied. "I don't. 6 months ago, I was happily married to a good man who loved me. Then he died, and I discovered he'd left debts I couldn't pay. The men he owed money to, they made it clear that if I couldn't pay with money, they expected me to pay in other ways." Samuel's face darkened. "They threatened you?" "They offered me a job in a place where decent women don't work. When I refused, they said they'd wait. But they made it clear that my choices were limited." Martha took a deep breath. "I sold everything I owned, but it wasn't enough. Coming here, marrying you, was my only option besides ... Besides what?" Samuel's voice was sharp now, protective. "Besides things I won't do, I'd rather die than live that kind of life." Martha met his eyes directly. "So no, Samuel, I'm not here looking for romance. I'm here because I need somewhere safe to build a new life. If you're offering that, and if you're willing to let me do the same for you, then maybe we can help each other." Heal, Samuel stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, like clouds moving away from the sun. "You understand what it's like to have nowhere else to turn." "I do, and I understand what it's like to lose everything you thought your life would be." Martha touched his arm gently. "I'm not asking you to love me, Samuel. I'm asking you to give us both a chance to be less alone in the world." They stood there in the cold mountain air, two wounded people recognizing something in each other. Martha could see Samuel thinking, weighing her words against his own fears and grief. "The ranch house still has Caroline's things in it," he said quietly. "Her dresses in the wardrobe, her books on the shelves. I haven't been able to. I couldn't bring myself to pack them away." "That's all right," Martha said. "I'm not trying to replace her, Samuel. I couldn't even if I wanted to. She'll always be your first wife, the mother of your child. I'm just asking to be your second chance." Samuel pulled the photograph out again and looked at it for a long moment. Then carefully he put it back in his vest pocket. "Carolyn would have liked you," he said finally. "She always said I thought too much and didn't trust my heart enough." "What does your heart tell you now?" Martha asked. Samuel was quiet for a moment, then looked at her with something that might have been hope flickering in his eyes. "It tells me that maybe two broken people can help hold each other up." "I think so too," Martha said. They walked back toward the hotel as the sun started to set behind the mountains. The air was getting colder, and Martha pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Without a word, Samuel took off his coat and draped it around her. It was warm from his body and smelled like leather and wood smoke. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it for more than just the coat. As they reached the hotel steps, Samuel stopped and turned to her. "Martha, I want you to know that if you marry me, I'll do everything I can to be a good husband to you. I can't promise love, not yet, but I can promise respect and protection and partnership. That's more than many marriages start with," Martha replied. "And Samuel, I think Carolyn would want you to be happy again. Not the same kind of happy you were with her, but happy in a new way." Samuel's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "You really think so?" "I do. And I think she'd want your ranch to have life in it again." Children's laughter echoing through the rooms. "She'd want your house to be a home, not a shrine." Samuel nodded slowly. "Then let's go inside and plan a wedding. Because Martha Whitmore, I think you might just be the answer to a prayer I was afraid to pray." As they walked into the warm hotel lobby together, Martha felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, but something that might grow into happiness given time and care. She was no longer alone, and neither was Samuel. Together, they might just be able to build something good from the pieces of their broken lives. That evening, Samuel invited Martha to have dinner with him in the hotel restaurant. The dining room was small and cozy, with oil lamps casting a warm glow over the wooden tables. Most of the other guests had already finished eating, so they had the place almost to themselves. Martha felt nervous as they sat down across from each other. The conversation that afternoon had changed something between them. They were no longer strangers trying to be polite. They were two people who had seen each other's deepest wounds and decided to move forward together anyway. The waitress brought them beef stew with fresh bread. And for the first time since Martha had arrived, they talked easily. Samuel told her about his ranch, how his father had started it with just a few cattle and built it into something respectable. The land was good for grazing, with a creek running through it and plenty of grass in the spring and summer. "It's not a big operation," Samuel explained, cutting his bread carefully. "I run about 200 head of cattle. In the spring, I hire a couple of men to help with the branding and moving the herds to different pastures. But most of the year, it's just me." "That sounds like a lot of work for one person," Martha said. "It is, especially since ... Samuel paused, then continued. "Since Carolyn died, I've let some things slide. The house needs repairs, the garden is overgrown, and I've been eating nothing but beans and bacon for months because I can't cook much." "Else," Martha smiled slightly, "I can cook. Thomas and I grew most of our own food, and I learned to make meals stretch when money was tight. You know about farming then?" We had chickens and a milk cow, plus a big vegetable garden. I know how to preserve food for winter and how to make soap and candles. I'm not afraid of hard work, Samuel." Samuel looked at her with something like relief in his eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that. Ranch life isn't easy, especially for a woman. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and in winter we can get snowed in for weeks at a time." Martha thought about the crowded, dirty streets of Cleveland, where she'd spent the last few months jumping at every sound, afraid that Mr. Jameson or one of his men would come calling. "Being snowed in sounds peaceful," she said honestly. They talked about practical things, what supplies the ranch had, what would need to be bought before winter set in hard, how they would divide the household duties. It wasn't romantic conversation, but Martha found it comforting. This was real life they were discussing, not fairy tale dreams. As they finished their meal, Samuel grew quiet again. Martha could see him working up the courage to say something important. Finally, he cleared his throat and looked directly at her. "Martha, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "All right." "Would you consider marrying me tonight?" Martha nearly choked on her coffee. "Tonight?" Samuel's face turned red, but he pushed on. "I know. It sounds crazy, but hear me out. We've both decided we want to go through with this marriage. We understand what we're offering each other, and we're both ready to start this new life. So why wait?" Martha set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. "Samuel, that's very sudden. Don't you think we should take more time to ... To what? To talk ourselves out of it?" Samuel leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Martha, I've been alone. For 2 years. Every day I wake up wondering if today will be the day I completely give up. And you ... You're running from men who want to hurt you. Every day you delay is another day they might find you." Martha felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't thought about Mr. Jameson following her, but Samuel was right. If Jameson was determined enough, he could find out where she'd gone. Mail-order bride advertisements were public, after all. "Besides," Samuel continued, "what difference will waiting make? We're not marrying for love. We're marrying for practical reasons, for companionship and protection and partnership. Those things won't change whether we marry tonight or next month." Martha studied his face in the lamplight. There was something desperate in his expression, but not the scary kind of desperate she'd seen in men's faces before. This was the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a rope. "You've been alone too long," she said softly. "Yes, and you've been afraid too long." "Martha, I can't promise you romance or grand gestures, but I can promise you safety. Once you're My wife, legally and properly, no one can touch you. And he paused, looking embarrassed. And I won't have to spend another night wondering if you'll change your mind and take the next train back to Ohio. Martha felt tears prick her eyes. Not from sadness, but from understanding. Samuel wasn't just asking her to marry him quickly, because he was impatient. He was asking because he was scared she would leave, just like everyone else he'd ever loved had left him. I won't change my mind, she said firmly. I can't go back, Samuel. There's nothing for me in Ohio but trouble. Then, marry me tonight. We can start our life together tomorrow instead of spending more time being scared and alone. Martha looked around the little dining room, thinking. The hotel clerk had mentioned that Judge Morrison lived nearby and would perform marriages at any time for a reasonable fee. It was already past 8 o'clock. If they were going to do this, they would have to move quickly. What about rings? She asked practically. Samuel reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. Martha recognized it immediately. It was Caroline's ring, the one from the photograph. Oh, Samuel, I can't wear that, Martha said, pushing his hand away gently. That was hers. She's gone, Martha. And she ... Samuel's voice caught slightly. Caroline would have wanted it to be useful again. She wasn't the kind of person to let something precious sit in a drawer when it could bring happiness to someone else. Martha looked at the ring, seeing how it caught the lamplight. It was plain but well made, the kind of ring that would last a lifetime. Are you sure? I'm sure. Caroline would have liked you, Martha. She would have wanted you to have this. Martha felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Taking Caroline's ring meant accepting her place in this family, in this life. It meant promising to care for Samuel the way Caroline would have wanted someone to care for him. If I wear this ring, Martha said slowly, I promise I'll try to make Caroline proud. I'll try to bring some happiness back to your life. Samuel's eyes filled with tears. That's all I can ask for. They left the dining room and went to the hotel desk, where the clerk gave them directions to Judge Morrison's house. It was only 2 blocks away on Elm Street behind the bank. As they walked through the snowy streets, Martha felt like she was floating outside her body, watching someone else's life unfold. Judge Morrison's house was a neat 2-story home with light glowing in the windows. Samuel knocked on the door, and after a few minutes, a middle-aged woman in an apron answered. We're sorry to disturb you so late, Samuel said politely, removing his hat. But we were hoping Judge Morrison might be willing to perform a marriage ceremony tonight. The woman looked them over carefully. Martha tried to stand up straight and look respectable, despite her worn clothes and nervous expression. Hold on, the woman said, and disappeared back into the house. They could hear voices talking in low tones, and then footsteps coming back to the door. Judge Morrison appeared, a kindly-looking man in his 60s wearing a nightrobe over his regular clothes. Young man, he said to Samuel, I've been performing marriages in this town for 20 years. I've learned to spot the difference between love matches and arrangements of convenience. Which is this? Samuel and Martha looked at each other. Martha appreciated that the judge was being direct instead of pretending not to notice the obvious. An arrangement, sir, Samuel said honestly. But one built on mutual respect and genuine need, Judge Morrison nodded approvingly. Good, those often last longer than the passionate ones that burn out after a few years. Are you both here of your own free will? Yes, sir, Martha said firmly. I came to Colorado specifically to marry Mr. Carter. We've talked honestly about what we expect from this marriage. And you, young man? You're not taking advantage of this lady's circumstances? No, sir. If anything, she's helping me more than I'm helping her. I've been lost since my first wife died. Martha is giving me a reason to start living again. The judge studied them both for another moment, then smiled. All right then, come inside. My wife can serve as a witness, along with our housekeeper. As they stepped into the warm house, Martha noticed the clock on the mantel. It was already 9:30. If they were going to be married before midnight, they needed to hurry. But as Judge Morrison led them into his parlor and began gathering the necessary papers, Martha realized she wasn't in a hurry anymore. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do. For the first time in months, she felt like she was moving toward something good instead of running away from something terrible. And that made all the difference in the world. Judge Morrison's parlor was warm and inviting, with a crackling fire in the stone fireplace and comfortable chairs arranged around a thick rug. The walls were lined with law books, and family photographs sat on the mantel next to the clock that seemed to tick louder than any clock Martha had ever heard. Mrs. Morrison bustled in with a tray of hot coffee and fresh cookies. Despite the late hour, she was a plump, motherly woman with kind eyes and graying hair pinned up in a neat bun. Behind her came Agnes, the housekeeper, a younger woman who looked curious but not judgmental about the late-night wedding request. "Now then," Judge Morrison said, settling into his favorite chair and pulling on his spectacles, "before we proceed with any ceremony, I need to ask you both some questions. Marriage is a serious business, and I won't perform one unless I'm satisfied that both parties understand what they're getting into." Martha felt her heart start beating faster. What if the judge decided they weren't suitable? What if he refused to marry them? She glanced at Samuel, who sat straight and alert beside her on the small sofa. "Miss Whitmore," the judge began, "you've traveled a considerable distance to marry a man you've never met. That suggests you were in some kind of difficult situation. Back home, am I correct?" Martha's cheeks burned, but she met his gaze directly. "Yes, sir. My husband died 6 months ago, leaving debts I couldn't pay. The men he owed money to made it clear that if I couldn't pay with cash, they expected other forms of payment. I refused, so I had to leave." Judge Morrison nodded gravely. "And Mr. Carter, you're a widower looking for a practical arrangement, rather than a romantic one?" "That's right, sir. My wife Carolyn died 2 years ago in childbirth. Our son died too. I've been struggling to manage the ranch alone, and—" Samuel's voice cracked slightly. "And the loneliness has been eating me alive. I need a partner, someone to help share the load of living. Have either of you discussed what will happen if this marriage doesn't work out?" the judge asked bluntly. Martha and Samuel looked at each other in surprise. They hadn't talked about that possibility. "Divorce is rare and difficult," Judge Morrison continued. "Once you're married, you're bound together legally and in the eyes of God, Miss Whitmore. If you marry Mr. Carter and later decide you can't stand ranch life, you can't simply walk away. And Mr. Carter, if you find that having a wife doesn't heal your grief the way you hope, you can't send her packing." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock. Martha could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She thought about what the judge was saying, that this decision would change her life forever, that there would be no going back. "Judge Morrison," she said finally, "I understand what you're saying, but I need you to understand something too. I'm not entering this marriage lightly or with unrealistic expectations. I know Samuel doesn't love me and I don't love him. Not yet, anyway, but we both need what the other can offer. I need safety and a home. He needs companionship and help. That's a foundation we can build on." Samuel nodded agreement. "Sir, No, I'm asking Martha to take a big risk. Ranch life is hard, and I'm not the easiest man to live with these days. But I give you my word that I'll treat her with respect and do everything I can to make her life better than what she left behind." Judge Morrison studied them both for a long moment, then turned to his wife. "Ellie, what do you think?" Mrs. Morrison had been quietly listening while she served coffee. Now she spoke up in a gentle voice. "I think they're being more honest than most couples who come to get married. At least they know what they're getting into. Half the romantic marriages I've seen end badly because people had impossible expectations." Agnes nodded agreement. "My sister married for love, and her husband turned out to be a drunk who spent all their money. These two seem to have their feet on the ground." Judge Morrison smiled at his wife and housekeeper, then turned back to Martha and Samuel. "Very well, if you're both certain this is what you want, I'll perform the ceremony. But first let me tell you what marriage means according to the law." For the next 10 minutes, the judge explained their legal obligations to each other. Samuel would be responsible for Martha's debts and welfare. Martha would be entitled to inherit his property. If he died first, they would both be expected to honor and support each other through whatever life brought their way. Do you both understand and accept these responsibilities? Judge Morrison asked. Yes, sir, they said together. The judge looked at the clock. On the mantel, it was already past 10:30. All right then, let's get you two married. Mrs. Morrison disappeared for a few minutes and came back with a small bouquet of dried flowers from her garden. Every bride should have flowers, she said. Pressing them into Martha's hands, Martha felt tears spring to her eyes at the unexpected kindness. The flowers smelled like summer and sunshine, a reminder that spring would come again even after the coldest winter. Judge Morrison opened his prayer book and found the marriage ceremony. He had performed so many weddings over the years that he barely needed to read the words, but he spoke them with dignity and respect for the sacred nature of what they were doing. Dearly beloved, he began, we are gathered here tonight to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but soberly and with full understanding of the commitment being made. Martha looked at Samuel as the judge spoke. His face was serious but calm, and when he caught her looking at him, he gave her a small, reassuring smile. She realized that despite everything, the unusual circumstances, the lack of romance, the fact that they barely knew each other, she felt safe with this man. Whatever happened, he would not hurt her. Samuel Carter, Judge Morrison said, do you take Martha Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Samuel's voice was steady and clear. I do. Martha Whitmore, do you take Samuel Carter to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Martha thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. Thomas's death, the debts, Mr. Jameson's threats, the long train ride across the country, the fear and uncertainty of the past few months. All of it had led her here, to this warm parlor in a small Colorado town, promising to share her life with a kind but broken man who needed her as much as she needed him. I do, she said, and meant it with all her heart. Do you have rings? The judge asked. Samuel pulled Caroline's wedding ring from his pocket. His hands shook slightly as he took Martha's left hand in his. The ring was a little loose, but it slipped on easily. As it settled into place, Martha felt the weight of Caroline's blessing somehow, as if the other woman was giving her permission to love Samuel in her own way. With this ring I'd thee wed, Samuel said softly. They didn't have a ring for Samuel. But Judge Morrison waved that aside. Many frontier marriages make do with one ring, he said kindly. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, Judge Morrison announced, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss. Your bride? Samuel hesitated for just a moment, then leaned down and kissed Martha's cheek gently. It was not passionate, but it was tender and respectful, and it felt right. The clock on the mantel began to chime as Mrs. Morrison and Agnes applauded. Martha counted the chimes, 11 o'clock. They had made it with an hour to spare. They signed the marriage certificate, making their union official. Martha felt a strange sense of completion. She was no longer Martha Whitmore, the desperate widow fleeing her past. She was Martha Carter, a rancher's wife with a future to build. When they stepped out into the cold night air, Samuel offered her his arm. Well, Mrs. Carter, he said quietly, what do you think of married life so far? Martha looked up at the stars shining brightly in the clear mountain sky. I think it's going to be an adventure, Mr. Carter. As they walked back to the hotel through the snowy streets, Martha realized she was no longer afraid. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And somehow, that made all the difference in the world. Back at the hotel, Samuel walked Martha to her room just as he had the night before, but everything felt different now. They were no longer strangers considering a marriage. They were husband and wife, bound together by law and promise. The hallway seemed quieter, the lamplight softer, and Martha was very aware of the gold ring on her finger. Samuel stopped outside her door and turned to face her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what they had just done hung in the air between them like morning mist. "Martha," Samuel said finally, his voice gentle but serious, "I want you to know that nothing has to change tonight. We may be married now, but I meant what I said about taking our time. There's no rush for for anything." Martha felt her cheeks grow warm, but she was grateful for his consideration. "Thank you, Samuel. That means a lot to me. Tomorrow I'll take you out to the ranch. You can see your new home, and we can start figuring out how to make this work." Samuel paused, then added quietly, "I know this isn't the wedding night most women dream of." "I stopped dreaming about fairy tales a long time ago," Martha replied honestly. "What we have is better than dreams. It's real, and it's built on honesty. That's more than many couples start with." Samuel smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, it reached his eyes. "Good night, Mrs. Carter." "Good night, Mr. Carter." As Martha closed the door behind her, she felt a strange mixture of relief and excitement. She was married. After months of fear and uncertainty, she finally had a place in the world again. She looked down at Caroline's ring on her finger and silently promised the woman who had worn it before her that she would do her best to make Samuel happy. Sleep came easier that night than it had in months. Martha woke to sunshine streaming through her window and the sound of activity in the street below. For just a moment she forgot where she was. Then she saw the ring on her finger and remembered she was Martha Carter now, wife of a Colorado rancher, and today she would see her new home for the first time. Samuel was waiting for her in the hotel lobby, looking more rested than he had since she'd arrived. He had already loaded her carpet bag into his wagon along with supplies he'd bought at the general store: flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities for the ranch. "I hope you don't mind," he said as he helped her up onto the wagon seat, "but I told Mrs. Henderson at the store that you were my wife now. Word will spread quickly in a town this size." "I don't mind," Martha said. People were bound to find out anyway. As they drove out of Cedar Ridge, Martha got her first real look at the country that would be her home. The town sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills that stretched toward the mountains. Everything was covered in snow now, but Martha could imagine how green and beautiful it would be in spring, and summer dot the road too. Samuel's ranch was just 2 wagon ruts through the snow, but the horses seemed to know the way. They passed a few other homesteads, small houses with barns and corrals, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear blue sky. Samuel pointed out his neighbors, though the nearest was still several miles away. "That's the Peterson place," he said, gesturing toward a distant house. "Good people. Tom Peterson helped me a lot after Carolyn died, when I could barely get out of bed in the morning." "It's nice to have good neighbors," Martha said, thinking of how isolated the ranch must feel in winter. "It is, though you won't see much of them until spring. The snow makes visiting difficult." After about an hour of driving, Samuel pointed ahead to a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley. "There it is, home." Martha's breath caught in her throat. The ranch house was bigger than she had expected, a sturdy 2-story building made of logs and stone. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and smoke was rising from the chimney. Nearby stood a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and a corral where a few horses stood with their winter coats thick and shaggy. "Samuel, it's beautiful," Martha sighed, and she meant it. The house looked solid and welcoming, surrounded by snow-covered pastures that rolled gently toward the foothills. "It needs work," Samuel said, but Martha could hear the pride in his voice. "My father built the original cabin, and I added on when I married Carolyn. The barn needs new shingles, and the porch steps are getting loose." As they got closer, Martha could see what he meant about needing work. The paint was peeling in places, weeds poked through the snow around the foundation, and one of the shutters hung crooked. But these were small things, problems that could be fixed with time and effort. Samuel stopped the wagon in front of the house and came around to help Martha down. She stood for a moment looking up at the building that would be her home. It felt surreal. Just 3 days ago, she had been sleeping in a tiny rented room in Cleveland, afraid to answer her door. Now she was standing in front of her own house in Colorado, married to a man who had promised to protect her. "Ready to go inside?" Samuel asked. The front door opened into a large main room with a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and windows that let in plenty of light. Martha could see Caroline's touches everywhere: embroidered pillows on the chairs, lace curtains at the windows, a piano in the corner that had been carefully dusted and maintained. "Caroline played beautifully," Samuel said, noticing Martha looking at the piano. "She used to fill the house with music every evening." "Do you play?" Martha asked. "No, I always meant to learn, but ... Samuel shrugged. "Do you? A little?" "My mother taught me when I was young." Martha touched the piano keys gently. "Maybe I could learn some of Caroline's favorite songs." Samuel's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears. She would have liked that. Samuel showed Martha through the rest of the house. The kitchen was well equipped with a large stove and plenty of storage. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms: the master bedroom that Samuel had shared with Caroline, a smaller room that would have been the nursery, and a guest room. "You can choose whichever room you'd like," Samuel said carefully. "The guest room has a good view of the mountains, and it gets morning sun." Martha understood what he was offering: separate bedrooms until they were both ready for something more. "The guest room sounds perfect," she said. Over the next few days they fell into a comfortable routine. Samuel showed Martha around the ranch, teaching her about the cattle and horses, the water systems and feed storage. Martha took over the cooking and cleaning, bringing warmth and order back to the house that had been merely survived in rather than lived in. The work was hard but satisfying. Martha found herself enjoying the quiet rhythms of ranch life: milking the cow in the morning, feeding the chickens, cooking meals on the big kitchen stove. In the evenings, she would play the piano softly while Samuel read or worked on ranch accounts. They talked more easily now, sharing stories about their childhoods, their hopes for the ranch, their plans for spring. Samuel told her about Caroline, and Martha told him about Thomas. Neither tried to hide their past loves or pretend they didn't matter. Instead, they honored those memories while slowly building something new together. One evening in late January, as they sat by the fire after supper, Samuel looked up from his ledger and caught Martha mending one of his shirts. "You don't have to do that," he said gently. "I know," Martha replied, not looking up from her stitching. "I want to—" It was a small moment, but something important passed between them. Martha wasn't mending his shirt because she had to, or because it was her duty as his wife. She was doing it because she cared about him, because his comfort mattered to her. "Martha," Samuel said quietly, "I need you to know something." She looked up from her sewing, seeing something serious in his expression. "When you first arrived, I thought this marriage would just be convenient, a way for both of us to be less alone. But you've brought something back to this house, something I thought was gone forever." "What's that?" Martha asked softly. "Life, real life, not just existing, from one day to the next. You've made this feel like a home again." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. "You've given me something too, Samuel. You've given me hope. For the first time since Thomas died, I feel like I have a future to look forward to." Samuel set down his ledger and moved to sit beside her on the sofa. "I think we're going to be all right, Martha. I think we're going to be more than all right." Martha looked around the warm, comfortable room, at the fire crackling in the hearth, at Caroline's piano in the corner, at the man beside her who had become so much more than a stranger offering shelter. Outside, snow continued to fall on the Colorado plains, but inside their home, spring was already beginning to bloom. The story of their midnight marriage would become part of Cedar Ridge folklore, the tale of the desperate woman who stepped off the evening train and the lonely widower who married her before the clock struck 12. But to Martha and Samuel, it was simply the beginning of a love story that grew slowly and surely, like everything worthwhile in life. They had started as 2 broken people helping each other survive. Now they were becoming partners, companions, and perhaps in time something even deeper. As Martha went back to her mending and Samuel returned to his accounts, Both of them smiled quietly. They had found their way home to each other, and that was worth more than all the passionate romances in the world.